Sometimes your heart finds love where you least expect it, with people you'd never imagine. In a world where everyone tries to tell you who to love and what love should be, real love doesn't follow any rules. Back in 1870s Colorado, Magnus. Thorne is a giant, 8 feet tall, and everyone in the mountains is scared of him. When Esther May shows up in his area with her kind heart and gentle ways, Magnus thinks it's crazy that someone like her could ever like someone like him. But the wild mountains teach tough lessons about love and staying alive. When life throws them together, something wonderful starts to grow between the huge man who feels like a monster and the woman who sees the good in him. What happens when she finds out she's pregnant with his baby? A baby he never thought he could have. Before we go on, let us know where you're reading from. And if you like this story, hit that subscribe button because I've got something super cool for you tomorrow. The morning fog hung over the Colorado mountains like a blanket, and Magnus Thorne liked it that way. He was 8 feet of muscle and bone, moving quietly through the early morning with a grace that didn't match his size. He could break a small tree with his bare hands. His cabin sat high on a rocky hill, 3 miles above Pine Ridge. Close enough to trade furs, but far enough to keep people away. Magnus built his home from scratch with just his grit and an axe. Every log was cut by him, every stone placed just right, because surviving out here meant paying attention to every little thing. Inside his cabin, you could see a side of Magnus nobody knew. It was rough, but had a kind of beauty. The rifle handle above his fireplace wasn't just useful. It was carved with a mountain scene so real you could almost hear the wind in the trees. Not many in Pine Ridge had seen the fancy designs Magnus carved into that wood during long winters. They only knew him as the scary mountain man who showed up at Jeremiah Walsh's trading post twice a year, quiet and huge, his light blue eyes scanning the room like a wolf looking for danger. Kids ran when they saw his shadow in the store's doorway. Women made the sign of the cross and hurried by. Men suddenly had other places to be. Magnus told himself he liked their fear. Fear was real. Fear kept people far away, where they couldn't. See the loneliness that ate at him like hunger, or how carefully he handled fragile things when he thought no one was looking. That September morning, the trading post was busier than usual. A wagon train had rolled in the night before. Families heading west before winter sealed the mountain passes. Magnus needed bullets and coffee to last until spring, but he stopped at the store's entrance. Too many people were crammed inside, their loud voices making him nervous. "That's him," someone whispered as Magnus ducked through the door, his huge body blocking the sunlight. "That's the giant." Magnus ignored the whispers and walked to Walsh's counter. The chubby shopkeeper's hands shook a bit as he grabbed Magnus's stuff, maybe from fear or maybe because he was excited about a cash sale. "Nice morning for trading, Magnus," Walsh said, his voice a little high. Magnus just grunted and put silver coins on the worn counter, the exact amount. No arguing, no chatting, no staying longer than needed. "Shame about the Hutchkins family," Walsh went on, filling the quiet. "Lost their youngest to fever 3 days ago. That's why they joined the Morrison wagon train. A new place can help with sadness, I guess." Magnus paused, his hand over his supplies. He knew what grief felt like, how it could empty you out until you're just a shell. He didn't say anything, but his face must have softened because Walsh kept talking. "There's a woman with them," the shopkeeper said. "Esther May Fletcher came from Missouri all alone. She's a seamstress, lost her whole family to cholera last spring. Parents, brother, even her fiancé. Brave lady, heading west by herself." Magnus picked up his stuff without a word, but his eyes drifted to the wagon camp outside the dirty store window. Cooking fires sent smoke into the chilly air, and he saw people moving around the wagons like busy ants. "She's a great seamstress, I hear," Walsh kept going, trying to get a reaction from his quiet customer. "Mrs. Morrison says her sewing is the best she's ever seen. Not much to look at, though, a big woman round like a barrel, but strong, and they say she's super kind." Magnus let out a harsh laugh that surprised even him. It came out loud and bitter in the small store. People turned to stare, shocked at the sound. "A kind heart," Magnus said, his voice rough from not talking much. "Like that matters out here." He shook his head, still chuckling darkly. "A soft woman won't last a month in these parts." This land chews up the weak. Walsh's face turned red. Now, Magnus, no need to... But Magnus was already walking away, his supplies under his arm. He pushed through the crowd at the door, their whispers fading as he passed. Just as he reached the entrance, someone stepped right in front of him. She was just like Walsh described, round and sturdy, with auburn hair peeking out from a plain bonnet. Her brown eyes looked right at him, not scared, even though he towered over her like a tree over a flower. She wore a dark blue dress, practical but nice, and her hands, Magnus noticed them right away, were small and neat, with calluses from hard work. "Excuse me," she said, calm and steady. "I think you dropped this." She held out a silver coin, one he'd put on Walsh's counter. Magnus stared down at her, aware that everyone in the store had gone quiet, watching the giant mountain man and this new woman. "I didn't drop anything," he said at last. "Maybe not," Esther May said, her face calm. "But someone did, and you were the last to leave. I thought you'd want to check." Magnus checked his pockets. His money was all there. He looked at Esther May Fletcher, the seamstress from Missouri, and saw something in her steady eyes that shook him. Not fear, not disgust, just a calm look that made him feel seen in a way he wasn't used to. "Keep it," he said roughly, then pushed past her into the morning air. But he stopped outside and glanced back through the window. Esther was giving the coin to Walsh and looking at a bolt of fabric with focus, like she knew quality when she saw it. Her fingers touched. The cloth the same way Magnus felt when he worked with good wood, like she respected it. As if she felt him watching, she looked up and met his eyes through the glass. For a second, something passed between them, maybe two lonely people recognizing each other. Then Magnus turned and walked toward the trail home, unsettled by the meeting in ways he couldn't explain. That night, as he carved by lamplight, Magnus kept thinking of those steady brown eyes and small, capable hands. The rifle handle he was working on seemed to come alive under his knife. Without thinking, he started carving a new detail into the mountain scene, a tiny wildflower growing from a crack in the rocks, delicate but tough in the harsh land. He put the work down before finishing the flower, bothered by his own urge. Tomorrow he'd focus on real stuff, checking traps, smoking meat, getting the cabin ready for snow. He had no time for silly thoughts about auburn-haired women who weren't scared of him. But when he finally slept, he dreamed of soft voices and wool skirts, of hands that could make beauty from plain cloth, just like he could make art from rough wood. Magnus woke before dawn, feeling his cabin was empty instead of peaceful for the first time in years. The wagon train would leave soon, taking Esther May Fletcher to her new life out west. Magnus told himself he was glad. The last thing he needed was trouble, especially the kind that came with kind brown eyes and a voice that wasn't afraid of him. He got dressed in the dark and got ready for another day alone, pushing away thoughts of small hands and steady looks. The mountains needed all his focus, and Magnus had learned long ago that surviving meant accepting his lonely life. Still, as he stepped into the cold morning air, his eyes drifted to the valley where the wagon train was camped, and he wondered if the seamstress from Missouri ever looked up at the mountains and thought about the giant who lived there. A blizzard hit 3 days earlier than any storm Magnus had seen in 15 years of mountain life. He'd felt it coming in his old injuries, but even he wasn't ready for the storm's fury. It roared down from the peaks like an angry beast. By noon, the wind screamed through the pines so hard that even old trees bent. Snow didn't fall in flakes, it came in waves, turning the world into a white mess. Magnus locked down his cabin and settled in to wait out the storm, thankful for his stocked shelves and stone fireplace. A horse's scream pulled him outside. No animal should sound like that. Pure fear and pain cutting through the wind. Magnus put on his heaviest coat and fought through the snow toward the sound. Each step was a battle against snow past his knees. The horse's cries got weaker as he pushed toward the main trail. He found them a quarter-mile from his cabin, a bay horse thrashing in a snowdrift, its leg twisted badly, and a figure in blue wool lying still in the snow. Magnus's heart jumped when he recognized her, even before he brushed the snow from her face. Esther May Fletcher was unconscious, her lips blue with cold, her breathing faint. The wagon train had left 3 days ago, but somehow she'd been left behind, caught in the storm. The horse had to be put down. Its leg was too broken to save. Magnus carried Esther's limp body through the snow, her weight light in his arms. Despite her sturdy build, she felt fragile, like bird bones, and so cold it scared him. His cabin felt tiny when he laid her on his narrow bed by the fire. Magnus worked fast, like a man who knew. Waiting could mean death. He took off her wet clothes carefully and wrapped her in his warmest furs and blankets. Her breathing stayed shallow, her skin pale as the snow outside. For 2 days, Magnus fought to keep her alive. He kept the fire, roaring, making the cabin warm as summer. He spooned warm broth into her mouth when she could swallow, held her when chills shook her so hard the bed frame rattled. In her fever, she talked about people named Sarah and Thomas, about sewing circles, and church parties, a life so different from his mountain world. On the 3rd morning, Esther May opened her eyes and looked at him clearly. "You saved my life," she said simply, her voice scratchy but steady. Magnus fussed with the coffee pot, uneasy under her gaze. Horse broke its leg. Had to put it down. "Poor thing," Esther May said, trying to sit up, then noticing she was wearing his spare shirt, her clothes drying by the fire. Her cheeks turned pink, but she didn't panic or scream. "I owe you an explanation." "You don't owe me anything," Magnus said, keeping his back to her, focusing on making breakfast. "Storm caught you. Could happen to anyone dumb. Enough to be on the trail this late." "I missed the wagon train," Esther said, her voice heavy with regret. "My horse threw a shoe 2 days back and I couldn't keep up. Mr. Morrison said they couldn't wait. Too dangerous with winter coming. He was right, but it left me stuck." Magnus turned, coffee pot in hand. "Morrison left you alone?" His tone made Esther's eyes widen. For the first time since he'd heard of her, Magnus felt anger rising, the kind that had scared people in his younger days. "He gave me supplies and directions to Pine Ridge," Esther said quickly. "It wasn't unfair, really. I'm the one who fell behind." "Like heck it wasn't unfair," Magnus snapped, setting the coffee pot down hard. "You don't leave people out here." His anger surprised them both. Magnus had been alone so long he'd forgotten how protective he could feel. He cleared his throat and went back to cooking, shaken by his reaction. "Well," Esther said after a pause, "I'm thankful you found me, no matter how I got lost." Over the next few days, as the storm raged outside, they settled into an awkward routine. Esther was quiet, not getting in his way. She fixed his torn shirts with tiny, perfect stitches, using thread from a small sewing kit she'd saved from her saddlebags. She cooked meals that tasted good, turning his plain food into something special. Most surprising, she wasn't scared of him. Not fully comfortable, maybe, keeping her distance in the small cabin, but not terrified either. She talked to him like he was just a regular guy, asking about the storm, complimenting his sturdy cabin, sharing little thoughts about mountain life. "You built this yourself," she said on the 4th night, touching the smooth logs of the wall. "Had to," Magnus said. "No one else up here to do it." "It's beautiful," Esther said, tracing a neat corner joint with her finger. "The pieces fit so perfectly, they hardly need anything to hold them together. You must know a lot about woodworking." Magnus shrugged, not used to praise. A guy learns what he needs to survive. But that night, by the fire, he started, telling her about the woodworking tricks he'd learned, the tools he'd made, how good it felt to make something strong from raw wood. Esther listened like she really cared, asking questions that showed she understood good craftsmanship. "It's kind of like sewing," she said thoughtfully. "Taking something plain and turning it into something useful and pretty." "Never thought of it like that," Magnus admitted. "My grandma taught me to see the dress in the fabric before I cut," Esther said. "She said the cloth would tell you what it wanted to be if you listened close enough." Magnus got what she meant. He'd felt the same with wood, sensing how the grain wanted to go, finding the shape hiding in the lumber. That someone so different from him could understand that felt strange and important. As the storm kept going, having Esther around started to get to Magnus. Her presence filled empty spots in his life he hadn't noticed before. The cabin felt more like a home with her quiet movements, her soft humming, the rustle of her skirts, and the faint lavender smell that followed her. But being close made him nervous. Closeness led to expectations, and Magnus had learned people always wanted more than he could give, leaving him feeling open and weak. Better to keep his walls up to stay distant and safe. On the sixth morning, the storm stopped. Magnus woke to a silence that felt heavy. After days of howling wind, sunlight poured through the cabin's window, showing a world covered in snow. "Weather's cleared," he said, stating the obvious. "Trail should be passable soon." Esther, who'd been darning his sock, looked up with a face he couldn't read. "Of course you'll want your space back." "It's not about what I want," Magnus lied, used to ignoring his own needs. "There's not enough food for 2 people all winter." "No, of course not," Esther said, folding the sock carefully. "I wouldn't want to stay longer than I should." Magnus told himself he was relieved. The cozy week had been a fluke, a temporary setup because of the storm. Soon Esther would go back to Pine Ridge, head west in spring, and his life would go back to normal. But as he started digging out the snow, Magnus kept noticing little things he'd gotten used to. Esther's sewing thimble shining in the firelight, the silver one from her grandma she wore like a lucky charm, the way she hummed hymns, how she'd organized his few books by topic instead of leaving them in a messy pile. These small touches made his rough cabin feel warm and welcoming. In 2 days, when the trail was clear, all signs of her would be gone. The cabin would go back to how it was, and Magnus would only have memories of sharing his space with someone who saw past his scary looks. He told himself that's what he wanted. Letting Esther May matter to him was too risky to think about. Magnus had learned long ago that caring about people only brought pain, and he'd built his whole life to avoid. That hurt. But as he cleared snow from his door, he moved slower than usual, like he was delaying the moment the outside world would break into their little safe space. For just a bit longer, he could pretend soft voices and small kindnesses were a permanent part of his life, not just brief gifts to cherish and let go. The trail stayed blocked for another week, and Magnus felt both relieved and uneasy. Each morning he checked the path to Pine Ridge, coming back with a blank face to say the snow was still too deep. Esther took the delays calmly, but Magnus caught her watching him sometimes with a thoughtful look that made him wonder what she saw behind his gruffness. She looked at him like she was piecing together a puzzle. "You don't have to sleep." "On the floor," she said on the 8th night, watching him lay out his bedroll by the fireplace. Magnus froze, spreading his blankets. "The bed's yours while you're here." "It's your bed in your cabin," Esther said practically, making it feel less scary. "We're both grown-ups and it's cold. I won't think less of you for being practical." Her offer hung between them, full of meaning Magnus wasn't ready to face. He'd gotten used to her during the day, but nights were different. Nights made him notice her breathing, the little sounds she made sleeping, how moonlight touched her auburn hair. "Floor's fine," he said roughly. "I'm used to it." But that night, as the wind howled and it got colder than ever, Magnus woke to Esther shivering hard under her furs. Her teeth chattered loud enough to hear across the room. Without thinking, Magnus grabbed his blankets and went to the bed. "Move over." Esther's eyes opened wide in the dim light. "You're freezing," Magnus said, explaining. "This is about staying alive, nothing else." She scooted over, and Magnus lay beside her carefully, feeling every spot where their bodies almost touched. He stared at the ceiling, trying not to notice her warmth through the blankets. "Thank you," Esther whispered. "I know this isn't easy for you." Magnus didn't answer, but her words eased something in his chest. She understood his discomfort without judging, saw his gesture as kindness, not expecting more. Slowly, their shared warmth stopped her shivering, and her breathing settled into sleep. Magnus stayed awake, shaken by how right it felt to have her close, how natural it seemed to share this small space with someone who wasn't scared of him. Morning brought awkwardness with the sunlight. Magnus woke first, as always, but didn't want to disturb Esther, sleeping peacefully against his shoulder. Her face looked younger, softer in sleep, without the careful control she kept up when awake. Her hand rested on his chest, small and pale against his dark shirt. When she woke, her brown eyes took a moment to focus. Then she blushed. "Good morning," she said quietly, not pulling away right away. "Morning," Magnus said, his voice rougher than he meant. "Storm's passed. Should clear more of the trail today." They got up carefully, acting like the night's closeness was just practical. But something had changed. A wall that had been crumbling finally falling, leaving something fragile and complicated. During the day, Magnus noticed things he hadn't before. How Esther tilted her head when sewing, a small scar on her hand from some childhood mishap, the graceful way she moved in the tiny cabin without bumping anything. She'd been making herself small, he realized, keeping her stuff in one corner, cooking only when he was busy, fixing his clothes but leaving them folded on his chair. It was the careful way of someone used to not being wanted, and it stirred something protective in him. That evening, as Esther cooked another meal from his simple supplies, Magnus watched her work. Her movements were quick and skilled, turning beans and pork into something tasty. She hummed old hymns, warming the cabin as much as the fire. "Where'd you learn to cook like that?" Magnus asked, surprising himself. Esther looked up from the pot. "My mom, mostly. She said a woman who couldn't make a good meal from whatever's around wouldn't last as a wife." Her face got sad. She was probably right, but it didn't matter in the end. "Your fiancé," Magnus said carefully, "the one who died in the cholera." "James," Esther said, her voice holding old sadness but no fresh pain. "We grew up together. Our families thought we'd marry, and we didn't see a reason to argue." "But you didn't love him," Magnus said, the words slipping out, too personal for someone he barely knew. Esther didn't seem mad. "I cared for him," she said slowly. "James was good, kind, steady. Love might have grown with time." She paused, stirring the pot. "But no, not the kind of love poets write about." Magnus wondered what kind of love Esther dreamed of. What kind of man could catch her quiet attention? The thought bugged him more than it should. "Why'd you come west?" he asked. "After losing your family, most folks would stay where it's familiar." "There was nothing left in Missouri," Esther said, her voice calm but pained. "James's family made it clear I wasn't welcome after he died. Said I brought bad luck. My sewing barely paid for a room above the hat shop, and my customers started going elsewhere." "So you decided to start over?" "I decided to try," Esther said, ladling stew into bowls with steady hands. "Oregon needs seamstresses, and I thought a place where no one knew my story might be kinder." Magnus took his bowl with a grunt, but his mind chewed on her words. Esther had lost everything: family, fiancé, job, home, and instead of giving up, she fought for a fresh start. That took guts he wasn't sure he'd have had. They ate quietly, the wind outside softer than the night before, as Esther cleared dishes. Magnus studied her, noting the strong set of her jaw, how her hands moved with quiet skill even in simple tasks. Later, as she mended another shirt by the fire, Magnus went to his workbench. Under a loose floorboard was a box he hadn't touched in years. Inside was his mother's wedding ring, a plain gold band that glowed in the firelight. Margaret Thorne wore it for 37 years through good times and bad, raising 7 kids and losing 4. She gave it to Magnus the day before she died, her eyes burning with fever. "This ring has seen real love," she'd whispered. "Not the easy kind, but the kind that grows strong in tough times. Don't let your father's poison make you think you don't deserve love. Promise me, Magnus, you'll try to find what your father and I never had." Magnus promised to ease her mind, but he never believed it was possible. How could a giant like him, rough and marked by violence, ever find that kind of love? Better to stay alone, keeping others safe from his potential to hurt. But with Esther's quiet presence in his cabin, Magnus wondered if his mom was wrong about his ability to love gently, or if he'd been wrong about not deserving it. He closed the box and hid it again, but the ring stayed in his mind like a quiet possibility. Tomorrow, if the weather held, he'd take Esther back to Pine Ridge. She'd find work, a way west, a new life with people who'd value her strength and kind heart. Magnus told himself that's what she deserved, a shot at happiness away from the hard mountain life. But as he set up his bedroll by the fire, he couldn't shake the feeling he was about to lose something he'd never dared hope for. Morning brought clear skies and cold that didn't kill. Magnus woke to find Esther packing her few things with the careful moves of someone used to moving often. Trail should be passable, Magnus said, stating the obvious because saying what her leaving meant felt too risky. Yes, I suppose so, Esther said, folding her spare dress neatly, her face calm but hard to read. I can't thank you enough, Magnus. You saved my life. Anyone would have, Magnus said. Esther paused, looking at him with soft disagreement. No, she said quietly. Not anyone, and not with such care. Her words hung heavy, full of meaning Magnus didn't want to look at too closely. He focused on getting ready for the trip to Pine Ridge, checking his rifle and packing supplies. But he kept stealing glances at Esther, watching how she handled her grandma's recipe book, a worn leather book of handwritten recipes she'd saved from her saddlebags. The pages were stained but clear, full of family secrets for feeding people with love. My grandma wrote most of these, Esther said, catching his look. She taught me a good meal can do more than fill your stomach. It can comfort, show care, bring people together. Magnus thought of their shared meals, how Esther turned his plain food into something special. She'd been showing care in the only way she could, and he'd been too focused on staying distant to notice. You'll make some family happy out west, Magnus said carefully. Something flickered on Esther's face. Maybe disappointment. Maybe, she said, though I've learned happiness comes when you're not looking for it. The trip to Pine Ridge took most of the morning, with Magnus leading through knee-deep snow that would have stopped anyone shorter. Esther followed in his footsteps, her breath puffing in the cold air, her pace steady. She didn't complain or ask to rest, keeping up with his steady march. As they got closer to town, they heard axes chopping wood, cows mooing, kids' voices in the air. Each sound felt heavy to Magnus, reminding him Esther belonged in that world, while he stayed an outsider. Pine Ridge's main street was busy despite the storm. People came out to stare at the odd pair, the giant mountain man and the woman with him. Magnus ignored their looks, focusing on getting Esther to the boarding house for a room. Mrs. Campbell, the boarding house lady, greeted Esther with a fuss. My dear, we thought you died in that awful storm. When the Morrison train said you were missing, we feared the worst. I was lucky, Esther said, glancing at Magnus. I found shelter. Mrs. Campbell's eyes widened at Magnus's huge frame. Oh my. Well, yes, I see that. How lucky. Magnus shifted, hating the curious stares. This was why he stayed away from town. The questions, the looks, treating him like a wild animal. I should go, he said to Esther, grabbing his rifle. Storm cost me a week of checking traps. Of course, Esther said, her voice steady but maybe a little sad. Thank you again for everything. Magnus nodded and turned to leave, but Esther's voice stopped him. Magnus. He looked back to see her holding a small cloth bundle tied with string. Some bread and jam for your trip back, she said. I know you have supplies, but... She trailed off, unsure. Magnus stared at the bundle, seeing it for what it was. A kind gesture disguised as practical. Esther had used her precious ingredients for him, thinking of his comfort even as she left his life. Thanks, he said roughly, taking it. There. Fingers brushed, and he felt her calloused hands, proof of a life of hard work. For a moment they stood frozen in the boarding house doorway, the town bustling around them but somehow separate. Magnus memorized her face, the coppery glints in her hair, the warm brown eyes, her quiet strength. Then Mrs. Campbell cleared her throat, and the moment broke. Magnus walked away without looking back, but he felt Esther's eyes on him until he turned a corner. The bundle in his hand carried her warmth, a reminder of kindness given freely. The climb back to his cabin took longer than usual, maybe from the tough trail or maybe because he didn't want to be alone again. His cabin, his safe place for 15 years, looked smaller when he got there, echoing with the absence of Esther's humming and gentle moves. Magnus built a fire and made a simple meal, but the cabin felt empty without her. Her neat book arrangement stayed, along with small signs of her, a folded towel, a tidily stacked woodpile, dust-free surfaces she'd quietly cleaned. That night, as he carved, Magnus worked on the rifle handle again. The wildflower he'd started during Esther's stay needed to be finished. His knife moved almost on its own, shaping a mountain columbine, Colorado's state flower, growing. From a rock crack, it showed beauty surviving in tough places, life thriving where it shouldn't. Magnus stared at the carving, shaken by its meaning and his need to finish it. 3 days later, he found a reason to go back to Pine Ridge. His supplies were fine, but a guy could always use more coffee and bullets. That's what he told himself as he hiked down. At Walsh's trading post, he heard Esther had started working for the Henderson family, whose wife was overwhelmed with twin babies and a busy house. Mrs. Henderson hired Esther as a seamstress and helper, giving her a room and food for her work. "She's a blessing," Walsh said, grabbing Magnus's stuff. Mrs. Henderson was losing it before Esther came. Now the house runs perfectly, and the babies look great. Magnus grunted but felt a twinge of jealousy. The Hendersons had what he couldn't give: security, community, a real place for Esther. As he left the store, he saw her across the street, coming out of the Henderson house with a laundry basket, moving quickly and purposefully. She wore a green dress that made her brown eyes warmer, her hair neat under a white cap. She looked happy, settled, and Magnus told himself he should be glad. But watching her go back into the house, he felt a sharp pang of loss. That night, alone in his cabin, Magnus stared at the finished wildflower carving. Its beauty mocked him, reminding him of chances he was too scared to take. For 1 week, his life had been warm and full of companionship, hinting at something more than just surviving. Now that chance lived 3 miles away, close enough to haunt him but too far to reach. Magnus told himself this was best. Esther deserved better than his harsh, lonely life. But as winter grew colder and nights stretched on, he wondered if his mom was right about love growing stronger in tough times, and if he'd been foolish to let his chance at love walk away without a fight. Winter hit the Colorado mountains hard, reminding Magnus why most people left for warmer places before snow came. By December, snowdrifts reached his cabin's roof, and the quiet was so deep his breathing sounded loud. Magnus told himself he liked being alone. The cold kept visitors away, giving him the solitude he'd chosen for 15 years. But memories of Esther's humming and soft talk echoed in the cabin, making the silence feel heavy instead of peaceful. He threw himself into winter chores, checking traps on snowshoes, smoking meat, fixing gear, anything to stay busy. But he couldn't fully shake thoughts of her brown eyes and careful hands, how she'd made his rough cabin feel like a home. The carved wildflower on his rifle handle glowed in the firelight each night, reminding him of the week his life had held more than just getting by. Magnus studied the petals like they held answers, thinking of the woman who inspired them. One freezing morning in mid-December, Magnus found fresh horse tracks near his cabin. They were hours old, half filled with snow, but clear. Someone had come close during the night and left without saying anything. He followed the tracks until they vanished in the trees, but found no other clues. The tracks weren't Esther's. Mare, she'd died in the storm, and they were too deliberate for a lost traveler. 3 days later, it happened again. This time, Magnus saw a rider from his window, a dark figure on horseback, too far to recognize but watching his cabin. When Magnus stepped out with his rifle, the figure vanished into the woods. The visits kept happening, always at dawn or dusk when it was hard to see. Magnus started sleeping lightly, his old danger instincts waking up after years of quiet mountain life. Someone was watching him, learning his habits, and it didn't feel friendly. His father's hunting knife, hidden in a drawer by his bed, seemed to hum with bad energy during the long nights. Magnus had carried it for 30 years without using it in anger. Its weight felt familiar, a reminder of the violence that shaped his early life. Ezra Thorne, his dad, was a cruel man who believed strength meant control, that love was a weakness to beat out of his kids. Magnus carried scars from his dad's lessons, both on his skin and inside. Those scars drove him to the mountains, looking for peace his family never had. The knife was all he had left of his father, kept not for love, but as a reminder of the man he swore not to become. Ezra died alone, and hated, abandoned by his kids and despised by everyone. Magnus vowed to break that cycle, to live free of the violence that marked his family. But the mystery rider stirred old fears about the cruelty he might carry, waiting for the right moment to come out. In January, Magnus went to Pine Ridge for supplies. The town sat under snow-covered roofs. Smoke, curling from chimneys showing warm homes. Magnus felt left out as he neared Walsh's store, knowing his arrival would hush any chatter. But this time, Walsh looked worried, not scared, when Magnus walked in. "Magnus, thank goodness," Walsh said, wringing his hands. "We've got trouble, the kind that needs someone like you." Magnus set his list on the counter and waited, sensing bad news. "Ute war party," Walsh whispered, though the store was empty. "Spotted 2 days ago near the Henderson place. Tom Morrison thinks they're planning a big raid when the weather clears." The news hit Magnus hard. The Henderson place, where Esther lived, caring for kids, thinking she was safe. "How many?" Magnus asked, his voice calm but cold. "Morrison saw 6, maybe more," Walsh said, his hands shaking as he grabbed Magnus's stuff. "We've sent for soldiers from Fort Collins, but it'll be weeks. We're just waiting for them to attack." Magnus took it in with the cold focus that kept him alive in danger. 6 Ute warriors could destroy Pine Ridge if they hit at the right time. The townsfolk were farmers and shopkeepers, not fighters, with weapons better for rabbits than raiders. "What's Morrison's plan?" Magnus asked. "Bring everyone to town. Fortify the church and store. Wait for soldiers," Walsh said, sounding doubtful. "He's told outlying families to leave their homes for now. But the Hendersons, stubborn as mules. Tom Henderson says his property's too valuable to leave. He'll defend it himself if he has to. He's got that woman, Miss Fletcher, helping with the kids, and he won't move them to safety." Anger surged through Magnus at the thought of Esther stuck in a remote house, with only Tom Henderson's shaky shooting between her and a war party. "Henderson's an idiot," Magnus said flatly. "I know, but a stubborn one," Walsh said. "Maybe you could talk sense into him. He might listen to someone like you." Magnus doubted Henderson would take advice from the scary mountain man, but it gave him a reason to do what he needed: make sure Esther was safe. The Henderson homestead was 2 miles west of Pine Ridge, a group of log buildings that looked nice but easy to attack. Magnus approached openly, rifle held low but ready. The place was too quiet. No kids in the yard, no smoke from the kitchen, no signs of a busy home. Tom Henderson came out with a shotgun, looking suspicious. Behind him, Magnus saw a woman's shadow at a window, making his heart race. "Esther." "Magnus Thorne," Henderson said carefully. "Didn't expect you off your mountain. Heard about your Ute problem," Magnus said. "Came to help." Henderson's eyebrows went up. The mountain man staying out of town business was well known, so his offer was a big deal. "That's kind of you," Henderson said slowly, "but we can handle it." "Can you?" Magnus looked at the homestead's weak defenses. 6 warriors could take this place in minutes. You've got women and kids to protect." As if called, Esther appeared in the doorway behind Henderson. She wore a plain brown dress and apron, her hair neat under a cap, but her face showed stress. When she saw Magnus, something flashed in her eyes. Surprise, maybe relief. "Magnus," she said softly, stepping forward with the grace he remembered. "Good to see you." Her words hit him hard, tightening his chest. She looked okay, but tired, and seeing her in danger made his protective side roar. "Miss Fletcher," Magnus said with a nod. "You okay?" "Okay enough," Esther said. "It's been tense." Henderson looked between them like he was starting to get why Magnus was really there. "You know Miss Fletcher?" "We met," Magnus said carefully, "during the storm last month." That seemed to satisfy Henderson, though Magnus saw a curious glint in his eyes. "Well, since you're here, join us for dinner. Martha's worried sick, and you being here might calm her." Magnus wanted to say no. Social meals were trouble he avoided, but it gave him a chance to check the homestead's defenses and keep Esther safe, so he agreed with a gruff thanks. The Henderson house was warm and full of family chaos. Martha Henderson, tired but kind, greeted Magnus nervously, while their twin boys, about 8, stared at him with wide eyes. "Boys, behave," Martha said gently. but Magnus liked their curiosity. Kids usually ran from him. Esther moved smoothly in the kitchen, helping with dinner with the same quiet skill Magnus remembered. She seemed to fit into the Henderson home, but he noticed her standing by windows, glancing at the dark forest, her shoulders tense with worry. The Ute threat had everyone on edge, but Esther handled it with the same strength she'd shown in his cabin. At dinner, Tom Henderson talked about his defenses with confidence, like he'd never faced real fighters. He mentioned boarded windows, extra bullets, and signal fires, as if they'd stop warriors. Magnus listened quietly, but his opinion of the situation got worse. The Hendersons were brave but clueless. Their plans gave false hope, not real safety. If Utes attacked, they'd die thinking they'd done enough. After dinner, as Martha put the kids to bed, Magnus was alone with Esther in the kitchen. She washed dishes quietly, trying not to stand out. "You shouldn't be here," Magnus said finally. Esther paused, then kept washing. "Where else would I be? The Hendersons need help and I need work. Morrison's setting up a safe place in town," Magnus said. "You'd be safer there." "I've made promises here," Esther said firmly. "These people have been good to me. I won't leave them when they need me." Magnus recognized her stubborn loyalty, the same strength that pushed her west instead of giving up in Missouri. Esther didn't abandon people, even when it was smarter to run. "The Utes won't care about your loyalty," Magnus said bluntly. "They'll kill you just as fast as anyone." Esther turned to him, her brown eyes steady. "Then I'll trust God and good friends to keep me safe." Her gaze held meaning, including Magnus as a friend, believing he could help them survive. Her trust was both humbling and scary. Magnus had avoided this kind of responsibility for 15 years, not wanting to be needed. But looking at Esther, brave, stubborn, precious, he knew he'd taken on that burden when he carried her through the blizzard. "I'll stay," Magnus said quietly, "until the danger's gone." Relief crossed Esther's face, though she hid it. "The Hendersons will be glad for the extra help." Magnus nodded, but they both knew he was staying for her because he couldn't stand the thought of her facing danger alone. That night, in the Henderson barn with his rifle ready, Magnus felt his father's knife against his hip and wondered if violence could ever be used for good. For 15 years, he'd hidden from his dark side, afraid of what he might become. But watching over Esther and the Hendersons, he started to think some things were worth fighting for, even if it meant risking the peace he'd worked so hard for. The next days were tense, with Magnus splitting time between checking the forest for Ute signs and helping Henderson strengthen defenses. The work kept him busy, but his mind stayed on Esther, moving quietly through the house, keeping things normal despite the danger. Her small hand mirror caught the morning light as she got ready, but Magnus saw her pause to look out windows, worry lines on her face that weren't there before. The threat had changed her calm, adding a fragility that made him want to protect her even more. "You're watching me," Esther said one morning as Magnus came back from checking the property. They were alone in the kitchen, the family still asleep. She held coffee, steam rising between them. "I'm watching for danger," Magnus said, though her words were true. Utes could hit any time. "Is that the only reason?" Esther's eyes searched his face, like she was looking for flaws to fix, the way she mended cloth. Magnus couldn't answer. The truth, that watching her was as necessary as breathing, that her safety meant more than his own, was too big to say. Instead, he took the coffee she offered and changed the subject. "Henderson's youngest wants to learn tracking," he said. "Might be good to teach him some basics." Esther smiled, seeing through his dodge but letting it go. "Billy's obsessed with you. Yesterday, he spent an hour trying to walk quietly like you do in the woods." The thought of the 8-year-old copying him warmed Magnus. Kids usually ran from him, but the Henderson boys treated him like something cool, not scary, asking endless questions about mountain life and listening to his gruff answers. "Kids need to know the wilderness," Magnus said. "Out here, not knowing can kill you." "You're good with them," Esther said. "Patient in a way that might surprise people who only know your scary side." Magnus shifted, uncomfortable. Being kind to kids felt easy, but having someone notice it made him feel open. Kids don't know to be scared of the right things. Or maybe they're smart enough to see past the outside to what's inside, Esther said. Her words hit hard, making his heart race. She saw through his walls, finding parts of him he thought he'd hidden. Before he could reply, Tom Henderson called from upstairs, starting the day. The moment passed, but Esther's words stayed with Magnus as he got ready for another watchful day. That afternoon, a patrol from Pine Ridge, led by Tom Morrison, came to check on the homesteads and share news. Morrison, a thin, serious man, was the town's unofficial defense leader. He looked at Magnus with respect and a bit of unease. "Any sign of the war party?" Morrison asked as they met in the Henderson parlor. "Tracks by the creek yesterday," Magnus said. "Old, but they're watching this place." Morrison's face darkened. "Same at other homesteads. They're learning our habits, looking for weak spots." "When will they hit?" Henderson asked, his confidence shaky for the first time. "Soon," Magnus said firmly. "They've had time to watch, and they won't wait for our defenses to get better or soldiers to show up." Morrison nodded. "We're telling all families to move to town in 2 days. The church can hold everyone, and we've got enough armed men to defend it." "I've said before, I won't leave my property," Henderson said stubbornly. "This homestead is years of work." "You can rebuild property?" Morrison argued. "You can't rebuild lives." The argument went on, but Magnus's attention drifted to the kitchen, where Esther worked quietly, her movements showing tension she tried to hide. She'd chosen to stay with the Hendersons despite the danger, her loyalty stronger than her fear. That evening, after Morrison's patrol left with promises to return, Magnus helped Esther with dinner prep. Chopping vegetables felt odd but nice, their movements like a familiar dance. "Morrison's right about moving to town," Magnus said carefully. "The church is safer." Esther paused over the pot she was stirring. "Would you leave?" The question caught him off guard. "What do you mean? If this was your home, your family's future, would you leave it to raiders?" Magnus thought hard. He understood Henderson's stubbornness. The homestead was security, hope, proof you could build something real. "I'd do what kept the people I cared about safe," he said finally, "even if it meant losing everything else. Nothing matters if the people you love are gone." His words came out stronger than he meant, showing feelings he'd tried to keep hidden. Esther looked up, her eyes wide, seeing what he'd accidentally admitted. "Magnus," she said softly, her voice so tender it hurt his chest. Before they could say more, Martha Henderson bustled in with the twins, filling the kitchen with chatter about bedtime stories. The moment faded, but Magnus felt its weight as Esther avoided his eyes the rest of the night. That night, in the barn, Magnus thought about love and how it made you vulnerable. For 15 years, he'd avoided caring to stay safe, but Esther had woken something in him he thought was gone. The sound of horses in the forest snapped him alert. Multiple riders, moving quietly like skilled hunters. He counted 6 horses, matching the Ute War Party reports. Magnus moved silently, checking his weapons, feeling his father's knife at his hip. He'd avoided fights for years, but protecting Esther and the Hendersons was worth facing his dark side. The riders passed without attacking, but their message was clear. They were ready to strike soon. Magnus stayed watchful all night, guarding the sleeping family, knowing tomorrow might bring the violence he'd run from for 15 years. As dawn came, Magnus decided he'd fight for what mattered, even if it meant becoming what he'd fled. Some things were worth losing yourself for, and Esther Mae Fletcher was one of them. Her mirror caught the morning light, reflecting a world about to change. Magnus watched the sunrise paint the forest gold and red, ready for whatever the day brought. The attack came at dawn, but not how Magnus expected. A lone rider approached the Henderson homestead openly, hands up for peace. Magnus watched from hiding, rifle ready. It wasn't a Ute warrior, but a white man in worn buckskins, his face rough from frontier life. "Hello, house," the stranger called. "Looking for Magnus Thorne." Magnus felt cold. No one should know his full name, especially not here. He'd only used his first name in Pine Ridge to stay hidden. The stranger pulled a yellowed paper from his saddlebag, a wanted poster with Magnus's face and a name he'd tried to bury. "I know you're here, Magnus," the man said. "Or should I say, Mountain Magnus M. Lan. This bounty says you're wanted for murder in Wyoming. $1,000, dead or alive." The Hendersons came out, confused and scared. Tom held his shotgun, looking between the stranger and Magnus, who stepped from hiding. "What's this about?" Henderson demanded, his voice shaky. Magnus moved calmly, rifle ready but low. The bounty hunter smiled, confident. "Name's Jake Cartwright," he said, eyes on Magnus. "Been tracking Magnus M. Lan for 3 years. Heard about an 8-foot mountain man up here. Not many like you." "Magnus?" Esther's voice held confusion and maybe hurt. She stood in the doorway, pale but steady. Waiting for answers Magnus wasn't sure he could give. 20 years ago, Magnus said quietly, his words clear in the morning air. "I killed 3 men in a bar fight in Cheyenne. They were attacking. A young girl, barely 16. I stopped them." His confession hung heavy. Henderson gripped his shotgun tighter. Martha pulled her kids close. But Esther's face hurt the most. Not scared or disgusted, just rethinking everything she knew about him. "Self-defense, huh?" Cartwright laughed harshly. "Witnesses said you went wild, broke one guy's neck with your hands, smashed another's head on the bar, gutted the third with your knife, like a beast tearing prey apart." Magnus felt the old darkness stir, the rage from that night in Cheyenne. He'd tried to talk the men down, but when they came at him, something wild took over, the brutality in his blood. They were going to hurt a kid, Magnus said, his voice low. "I couldn't let that happen." "Maybe," Cartwright said, "but you didn't stop with saving her. Witnesses said you kept hitting the last guy after he was down, after he was dead. That's what made it murder." The words hit hard because they were partly true. Magnus had lost control, letting the violence take over until he wasn't saving anyone, just giving in to his father's rage. "Why now?" Magnus asked. 20 years is a long time for a bounty." "Bounty's bigger now," Cartwright said, smiling. "One of those men's sons got rich in Montana silver mines. He's offering $5,000 for his dad's killer. Doesn't care if you're dead or alive. $5,000 was a fortune." Magnus saw why Cartwright had tracked him so long, why his eyes gleamed with greed. "I'll go with you," Magnus said simply. "Leave these people out of it." "Magnus, no!" Esther stepped forward, her calm breaking. "You can't give up to this man." But Magnus was already thinking. Distances, angles, how to keep the Hendersons safe if a fight broke out. Cartwright wasn't alone. Magnus sensed others in the woods, likely the men posing as Utes to hide their real goal. "Smart move," Cartwright said, nodding. "But my men have this place surrounded. We've watched it for weeks. Learned your routines. Try anything brave, and these folks pay." 3 more men stepped from the woods, armed and positioned, to control the homestead. Magnus saw their setup. Professional, maybe ex-soldiers. "The Ute raids," Henderson said slowly, realizing. "That was you. Had to keep the town scared," Cartwright said. "Can't have soldiers or armed folks messing up our job. A few horse tracks and arrows make people think Indians are coming." Magnus felt sick. The fear in Pine Ridge, the danger he thought threatened Esther and the kids. It was all fake, a trick to trap him. "You're making a mistake," Magnus said, his voice sharp with the violence he'd kept locked away for 20 years. "These people did nothing to you. They'll keep doing nothing if you cooperate," Cartwright said, hand on his pistol. "Though that seamstress complicates things. Can't leave witnesses to our tricks." The threat to Esther lit a fire in Magnus's chest. For 20 years he'd hidden his dark side to protect others, but the thought of harm to the woman he loved cracked his control. "Touch her, and I'll kill you all," Magnus said quietly, meaning every word. Cartwright laughed. "There's the Magnus M. Lan I've heard about, the man-killer who crushed skulls. How many have you killed since Cheyenne? How many bodies are up in these mountains?" "None," Magnus said truthfully. "I came here to leave that life." "But it found you, didn't it?" Cartwright said, smug. "Violence always finds men like us, Magnus. We can run, hide, but it's in our blood. We become what we're meant to be." Magnus saw Esther's reflection in her hand mirror, her face showing fear, strength, and maybe understanding. She saw him clearly now, not just the gentle man who saved her, but the killer he'd tried to leave behind. "Magnus," she said softly, "whatever you did 20 years ago doesn't make you who you are now." But Magnus wasn't sure. As Cartwright's men closed in, as the violence he'd avoided rushed toward him, the old darkness stirred. Maybe Cartwright was right. Maybe some men were born for violence, doomed to destroy everything they cared about. Magnus looked at Esther, memorizing her face before his inner monster broke free, wondering if she'd still know him after the fight. The standoff lasted all morning, tense as a tightrope. Cartwright's men held their spots around the homestead, while Magnus planned, looking for any edge to protect the innocent people caught in this mess. Esther had gone inside with Martha and the kids, but Magnus felt her watching from the windows, her presence both comforting and terrifying. If a fight started, she'd be in danger, and the thought of losing her to his past made him furious. "We can do this easy or hard," Cartwright said, lighting a cigarette with fake calm. "Easy, you come quietly, and these folks never see us again. Hard, there'll be a lot more graves." Magnus studied Cartwright, seeing the cold look of a man who'd killed for money before. These weren't lawmen. They'd kill witnesses without blinking. "I need to get my things," Magnus said. "Stuff from my cabin." Cartwright's eyes narrowed. "What kind of stuff?" "Things from my mom, keepsakes I don't want to leave." It was half true. Magnus had sentimental items, but the cabin had weapons and advantages that could help. If he could split Cartwright's men, get them away from the family, he might end this without blood. "Nice try," Cartwright said, smirking. "But I'm not dumb. We'll send 2 men with you to make sure you don't get tricky." Magnus expected that. "Fair enough, but the woman comes with me." "What?" Cartwright looked surprised. "Miss Fletcher has stuff at the cabin, too," Magnus said, keeping his voice steady. "Things she left during the storm. She'll want them before I'm gone for good." It was a lie. Esther left nothing, but if he could get her away from the homestead and the kids, he might save her. Cartwright thought it over, looking between Magnus and the house. "Why should I care what she wants?" "Because you need her alive to control me," Magnus said bluntly. "Kill the Hendersons, and I don't care. They're strangers, but Miss Fletcher matters. Hurt her, and I stop playing nice." It was risky, showing his feelings, but Magnus had no other moves. If keeping Esther safe meant showing his heart, he'd do it. Cartwright's smile was cold. "The mountain man's got a girl worth dying for. How sweet. Deal." He waved to 2 men. "But Henderson and his family stay here to keep you in line. Try anything, and they're done." Magnus nodded, hating it but accepting. At least Esther would be away from the worst danger, giving him options. "Miss Fletcher," he called, "we need to get your stuff from the cabin." Esther came out slowly, pale but calm. She'd heard enough to know the dangerous game they were playing, and her brown eyes met his with trust that humbled him. "Of course," she said. "I should get my things." The trip to the cabin took most of the afternoon, with Cartwright's men trailing them. Magnus and Esther rode quietly, both knowing this might be their last stand. As they climbed to his cabin, Magnus noticed things he'd ignored. The sunlight through the pines, the wind in the branches, the smell of snow and trees that had been his home for 15 years. "Magnus," Esther said softly as they neared the cabin, "whatever happens, I want you to know—" "Don't," Magnus cut in gently. "Save it for after we get through this." But Esther shook her head, determined. "If we don't—" "Make it! You need to know what you did 20 years ago, why you did it. It doesn't change who you are now. You saved me from the storm, protected the Hendersons, been kind to kids who saw the real you." Her words cut through the self-hate he'd carried for 20 years. In her eyes, he wasn't defined by his worst moment, but by all his choices. The man he'd fought to be, not the monster he feared. "Esther," Magnus said, her name like a prayer. "If something happens to me—" "Nothing's happening to you," she said firmly. "We're getting through this." They reached the cabin as evening shadows grew. The place looked smaller, more open to attack than he remembered. But inside were weapons, ammunition, and the cradle he'd carved, a symbol of hopes he'd never voiced. He'd started the cradle during long winter nights, working by firelight when he couldn't sleep. It was smooth as silk, every piece fitted perfectly to last generations. He told himself it was just practice, but deep down, he'd been carving a future, a child sleeping safe in a family that filled his cabin with love. The cradle was his dreams made real. Now, as Cartwright's men surrounded the cabin, those dreams hung by a thread. One wrong move, and everything he hoped for could be gone. "Nice work," one bounty hunter said, touching the cradle's curves. "Shame to waste such skill on a killer." Magnus stayed quiet, but his fists clenched. The cradle wasn't just wood. It was hope, love, in the only way his rough hands could show it. As evening came and Cartwright's deadline neared, Magnus got ready. He checked hidden weapons, planned escape routes, and caught Esther's eye, silently sharing his plan. She nodded, understanding sparking between them. Whatever happened, they'd face it together, and maybe that shared courage would be enough. The cradle sat in the corner, a reminder of dreams that might not come true, but it gave Magnus strength. He'd carved it with love and hope, and those would guide him through the dangerous hours ahead, not his father's knife. As night fell, Magnus prepared to see if love could beat the violent past he'd run from, and if a man could escape his sins when everything he cared about was at stake. The attack came at midnight, but not how anyone expected. Esther's labor pains started at sunset, waves of pain that left her gasping, clutching the cabin's walls. Magnus stared, shocked, as she bent over, hand on her round belly, a roundness he'd missed under her loose dresses. "The baby," Esther whispered, pale with pain and maybe shame. "Magnus, I'm sorry. I should have told you." "How long?" Magnus asked, his mind spinning as things clicked. Her careful movements during their week together, the loose clothes, the morning sickness he thought was from the storm. 6 months, Esther gasped through a contraction. "Since our time in the cabin. That night." She didn't finish. Magnus remembered the night when comfort turned to closeness, when two lonely people found comfort together. He thought it was a weak moment, a slip in his walls, but it had created life. The woman he loved was having his baby in the middle of a deadly standoff with men who'd kill them without hesitation. "Jesus," one of Cartwright's men muttered from near the door. "What now?" Outside, Magnus heard movement, bounty hunters shifting, unsure how a baby changed their plan. Through the window, he saw lantern light flickering in the trees as they talked. "Keep her quiet," the bounty hunter inside hissed, pointing his rifle at Esther. "Her screaming will bring everyone running." Magnus moved like a predator, protecting his family. His hand grabbed the man's throat before he could finish the threat, lifting him off the ground easily. The rifle fell as the man clawed at Magnus's grip. "You won't touch her," Magnus said, his voice deadly. "You won't even look at her while she's having my baby." The man's eyes bulged, face purple as Magnus squeezed. The old darkness roared in him, the rage from Cheyenne. But Esther's voice cut through. "Magnus," she gasped. "Don't. The baby needs you calm, not angry." Her words stopped him. He looked at the man, then at Esther, struggling to bring their child into the world, and chose something new. He dropped the man, who fell, gasping. Instead of killing, Magnus turned to Esther. "What do you need?" he asked gently, though violence still buzzed in him. "Clean cloth," Esther said. "Hot water, something to cut the cord." Magnus moved fast, gathering supplies while watching the bounty hunter, who stayed down, rubbing his throat, looking scared and confused. Outside, Cartwright's men argued, frustrated and unsure. They'd planned for a fight, not a birth. "This is a gift," Magnus said more to himself. "They won't shoot while you're in labor. Too risky with settlers." "Nearby." Esther nodded, understanding even through her pain. "How long till dawn?" 6, maybe 7 hours, Magnus said, pressing a cool cloth to her forehead, amazed at her strength. "Can you hold on?" "Babies come when they're ready," Esther said with a weak smile. "This one's coming tonight." For hours, Magnus lived in two worlds, one tracking every sound outside, ready for a fight. The other focused on the miracle of Esther giving birth. She worked through pain with quiet courage, biting a leather strap to stay silent. Magnus held her hand, amazed at her strength, redefining what he thought bravery was. The bounty hunter, Peters, sat quietly in the corner, cowed by Magnus's violence but still a threat if things changed. "You didn't know?" Peters asked during a quiet moment, his voice rough. Magnus shook his head. "She never told me." "Why not?" Magnus looked at Esther's sweaty face, remembering her shame. "Because she's a good woman who didn't want to burden me." Peters laughed harshly. "Some woman having a baby in a gunfight." "Some woman," Magnus said proudly. As dawn neared, Esther's labor got harder. Magnus became a midwife, using half-remembered stories from his mom about his siblings' births. "I see the head," he said, voice tight. "The baby's coming, Esther. Just a bit more." Horses approached outside. Cartwright's patience was gone and more men were coming. But Magnus focused on the baby. It arrived with the sunrise, small, perfect, silent. For a scary moment, Magnus thought it was gone. Then Esther touched its chest, and it cried, filling the world with hope. "A son," Magnus whispered, holding the baby with hands that had killed but now held life. "We have a son." Esther smiled, exhausted, touching the baby's face. "He's beautiful, perfect." Cartwright's voice broke the moment. "Time's up, Magnus. Come out empty-handed or we're shooting." Magnus looked at his son, then Esther, and felt a shift. The darkness was there, but love was stronger. Love for his family. He wrapped the baby in cloth from Esther's sewing kit, placing it in the cradle he'd made. The sight of his son in the bed he'd crafted felt right. "Stay with him," Magnus told Esther firmly. "No matter what, protect our son." Esther's eyes showed fear and understanding. "Magnus, don't do anything stupid." But Magnus was already moving, the birthing cloth in his hands, a reminder of what he was fighting for. His past violence was about to meet the love defining his future, and he was ready to see which one. He stepped outside into the dawn, hands empty as promised, eyes burning with intent. The baby's blanket, made from his furs and Esther's fabric, stayed inside, wrapped around the son he never expected. Cartwright and 5 men stood in a half-circle, weapons on Magnus, but they looked unsure. Cartwright's confidence was shaky, doubt in his eyes. "Well," Cartwright said, faking a smile, "congrats, I guess, though a baby in this mess isn't smart." "Let them go," Magnus said, his voice clear. "The woman and baby aren't part of your fight with me." "Can't do that," Cartwright said, gripping his rifle. "Too many witnesses now." Magnus had expected that and planned during Esther's labor, studying the men, their weapons, their weak spots. "You made a mistake," Magnus said, stepping forward, making men flinch. "You let me protect something worth more than my life." Before anyone could move, Magnus exploded into action, his father's violent blood now serving love. He reached the nearest man in 2 steps, grabbing the rifle and snapping it like a twig. The broken pieces became weapons as he moved among them. 20 years in the mountains had made him strong, and protecting his family woke reflexes he thought were gone. The first man fell with a broken collarbone, screaming as Magnus's elbow hit like a hammer. The second fired a wild shot before Magnus's fist crushed his ribs, knocking his breath out. Cartwright shouted orders lost in the chaos. His plan falling apart as Magnus became a storm of destruction. He fought to disable, not kill, but each blow was strong enough to end a fight. "Burn the cabin," Cartwright yelled, aiming at the house where Esther and the baby were. The threat to his family broke Magnus's restraint. He'd been holding back, but that ended now. He grabbed Cartwright's rifle barrel, bending it, and lifted the man by the throat like a toy. "You shouldn't have threatened my family," Magnus said, his voice barely human. The old darkness surged, and for a moment, killing seemed easy. But his son's cry from the cabin stopped him, cutting through the rage. His child deserved a father who didn't solve problems with murder. Instead of killing, Magnus threw Cartwright against a tree, knocking him out, but leaving him alive. The other bounty hunters stared, terrified, their weapons useless against Magnus's power. These tough men had never seen anything like him. "Leave," Magnus said. "Take your wounded and go. Don't come back." They didn't argue, grabbing their injured and fleeing into the woods like scared animals. Magnus stood alone in the clearing, surrounded by battle wreckage, but victorious in a bigger way. He'd faced his family's violence and chosen control, protection over destruction. The darkness was still there, but it didn't define him anymore. He was more than his father's son, more than his worst mistakes. Magnus turned to the cabin, hands shaking as the fight's rush faded. Through the door, he saw Esther sitting up, their son against her chest. The baby's blanket, their shared creation, glowed in the morning light. "Is it over?" Esther asked as he came near. "It's over," Magnus said, sitting beside her. "They won't be back." Esther leaned against him, tired but relieved. "You didn't kill them?" "No," Magnus said softly. "I wanted to, especially Cartwright. But our son deserves better." They sat quietly, watching their child sleep in the cradle. The baby was perfect, full of possibilities. Magnus made silent promises to be the father his son needed, to leave a legacy of love, not violence. "What'll we name him?" Esther asked softly. Magnus thought of his violent past and breaking that cycle. "James," he said, "after your fiancé. A good man should be remembered." Esther's eyes filled with tears, grief, gratitude, love. "James Thorne," she whispered. "It's perfect." Outside, the morning was calm again, the violence fading into memory. Inside, a new story was starting, written in love and hope, not blood. Magnus touched his son's face, amazed at its softness. This child would grow up knowing love, not fear, with parents who chose each other despite everything. The baby's blanket, their first family creation, would always remind them of the morning love-beat violence when a giant found his greatest strength was protecting those he loved. 6 months later, a photographer from Denver took a picture. That became their most precious treasure. Magnus sat stiffly in a reinforced chair, Esther stood beside him in her best dress, and baby James rested in her arms. The baby looked at the camera with eyes showing his dad's smarts and his mom's gentle strength. The family photo sat on their expanded cabin's mantel, proof of a love born in unlikely places. Magnus added 2 rooms in spring, making space for their growing family and the happiness he never thought possible. His life, once so lonely, was now full of family sounds. Esther's humming, James's giggles, the rustle of home life that felt as vital as breathing. Pine Ridge slowly accepted Magnus, though it took time. People had to get used to the giant who wasn't so scary, who brought his family to church and helped with heavy tasks. Tom Morrison was one of the first to befriend him, grateful for Magnus's protection from what they thought was a Ute threat. "Having an 8-foot guardian angel ain't bad," Morrison joked after learning about Cartwright's trick. The Hendersons became their closest friends, their kids playing with James, their home a second safe place. Tom Henderson moved his family closer to town, valuing neighbors after seeing the need for community. Magnus became the town's unofficial protector and problem solver, his fairness and love for his family overcoming old fears. The irony wasn't lost on him. Violence he'd run from, when guided by love, helped him fit into society. Esther became Pine Ridge's top seamstress, her skills wanted everywhere. But her gentle effect on Magnus won the town's respect most. People saw how he softened around her, his rough face turning tender when she spoke. Their son James grew strong in the mountain air, big like his dad, but with a kind heart, free of the family's old darkness. Magnus carved toys for him, wooden animals and puzzles, each piece full of love. "He'll be spoiled rotten," Esther teased one night, watching Magnus give James a carved horse. "Good," Magnus said. "He should know he's loved, grow up sure of his worth." It was a choice to give James the love Magnus never had, breaking the cycle of harshness. The cabin became a spot for town kids, drawn by Magnus's stories and cool woodworking. Parents who once feared him now encouraged their kids to befriend him, learning to see his kind heart. "Tell the bear story, Mr. Magnus," Billy Henderson would beg, sitting with other kids. Magnus told tales of wilderness adventures, teaching respect for nature and understanding over fear. Esther watched proudly, seeing her husband become a protector and teacher for the whole town. Their marriage was made official in a simple church ceremony, with everyone there to see the love already blessed by their son. Magnus wore a tailored suit, Esther a silk dress she sewed herself. Baby James cried during the vows, and Magnus took him, calming him against his chest. The sight of the giant soothing his baby while pledging love to Esther made everyone cry. As winter came again, Magnus looked forward to it. Unlike his lonely years, this year would have family traditions. Reading by the fire, teaching Esther survival skills, planning home improvements for their growing family. Esther was pregnant again, maybe a daughter this time, filling Magnus with joy and worry. "Do you ever regret it?" Esther asked one night by the fire, James asleep in the cradle. "Giving up your quiet life?" Magnus looked around their home, full of happy signs. The family photo, Esther's sewing, James's toys, the smell of home cooking. "I didn't value solitude," he said. "I valued safety, keeping others safe from what I thought I'd become. But I learned something." "What's that?" Esther asked. "Love doesn't weaken us," Magnus said. "It makes us who we're meant to be." Esther smiled, snuggling closer. "And who are you meant to be?" Magnus looked at his son, then at Esther, who saw past his scary outside to his broken heart. "A husband, a father, a man who builds, not breaks." Snow fell outside, but the cabin stayed warm with family love. The Mantles family photo would soon have more pictures of birthdays, holidays, first steps, and everyday joys. Magnus had found home, not in a place, but in a purpose. The violence that drove him to the mountains was still part of him, but now it served love. He was the guardian of his precious world, and that role turned him from a man running from demons into one at peace with them. Sometimes the heart finds love in the strangest places, with the unlikeliest people. And sometimes, if we're lucky, that love can change us completely, turning monsters into men and lonely souls into the heart of a family that lasts forever. The snow kept falling outside their mountain home, but inside, warmth lasted forever. Not from the fire, but from the steady glow of love that had found its true home.